At the start of 2024, I released an hour-long video titled The Method of Cosmic Thinking in 4 Lifetimes. Here's a quick overview of its main thesis. The first lifetime belongs to Johannes Kepler, a German astronomer who famously discovered the original mathematical proofs for heliocentrism. In the year 1617, Kepler went to a book fair where he encountered a massive book containing mystical illustrations of geocentrism. The author was an Englishman named Robert Fludd, and Kepler's problem with his work was that it used the same method of cosmic harmony that Kepler was using to defend Copernicus. Kepler criticized Fludd for basing his theory on a dream, delighting in pictures, and preferring ancients over moderns. In response, Fludd wrote that Kepler's astronomy dealt with shadows, not substance, effects, not causes, and exterior motions instead of internal and essential impulses. Thus began the Kepler-Fludd polemic, which continued from 1619 until 1623. Their dispute follows the pattern of the Archetype of Conflict, with strong parallels to the Peterson-Dawkins debate. But the first modern scholar to appreciate Kepler's argument with Fludd was the physicist Wolfgang Pauli. Pauli truly was a scientific genius and a protege of Albert Einstein. But he was also a deeply troubled man, and his self-destructive habits were putting his professional career at risk. He sought psychiatric help from Carl Jung, who became his friend and colleague over the next 25 years. In 1952, they co-published 2 essays, Jung on synchronicity, and Pauli on the Kepler-Fludd polemic. Pauli identified in Fludd the possibility for a reunified scientific worldview, a goal that Einstein himself was pursuing in the wake of the quantum revolution. The name I chose for this hypothesis was Pauli's conjecture, that in order to reunify science, we must recognize the significance of the pre-scientific stage of knowledge. The life of Robert Fludd is not known to us in great detail, but in the right context, his work shines as brilliantly as Kepler's. Fludd was a Renaissance Neoplatonist, a synthetic thinker who symbolized his arguments in a refined esoteric style. The modern academic field of Western esotericism studies people like Fludd, under the broad category of rejected knowledge. However, there is a good reason why theories like Fludd's were rejected in favor of science. How are we supposed to recognize pre-scientific knowledge as knowledge if we can't test it for ourselves? This is what I called the synthesis problem, and it appears that current scholarship in Western esotericism has not produced a convincing response to this. The best answer that I've discovered is the life of Buckminster Fuller. By turning his own life into an experiment, Bucky seems to have solved the synthesis problem. The evidence for this comes from his 2-volume work on the geometry of thinking called Synergetics. Comparing the diagrams from Synergetics with Fludd's symbolism, I claimed that Bucky has given us the resources to prove Pauli's conjecture. Or in other words, that Synergetics can help us to reunify science. I concluded my video by suggesting that Bucky was using a method of cosmic thinking, in the same unifying spirit as Renaissance humanism. As we embark on part 4 of this series on memes, we are shifting focus from the reunification of science to the reunification of strategies, A and B, that are fighting for the truth. Let's begin by comparing the Kepler-Fludd polemic to the Peterson-Dawkins debate that we examined in part 2. As A strategists, Dawkins and Kepler have similar values, which can be called ideas, but more specifically, proofs. Both authors proved that their ideas were not just their opinions, but actually revealed something true about the natural world. This is part of the legacy of natural science, where Dawkins built on Darwin, Kepler built on Copernicus. Everyone knows that these men have earned their place in the tradition of science, a tradition that's been largely defined by the A strategy. By contrast, the B strategy has defined a tradition of symbolism. Peterson has done his part by reframing social issues with a psychology of religion, particularly in his biblical lectures. In a similar vein, Flood used illustrations to represent ancient and mystical opinions. He even admitted that my opinions are not new, but rather are the most evident explications and most clear demonstrations of the secrets of nature. What is really puzzling here is why Flood believed that the meaning of his symbols was self-evident, while simultaneously arguing that Kepler's empirically verified mathematics was an inferior form of knowledge. His perspective seems totally backwards, which is why Kepler said that Flood was delighting in pictures, a remark that's essentially identical to Dawkins' drunk on symbols. But as we learned in Part 3, symbols have a significant role to play in matters of synthetic truth. When it comes to opinions of God, for example, Flood's pictures become very clear indeed. In the opening pages of his book, Flood presented this symbol, labeled as a demonstration. In the heaven of the Trinity, God is named Deus, and notated with the variables A, B, and C. Within this heaven is the creation, 4 layers, notated D, E, G, and F. This entire symbol of a Trinitarian God is both Kepler's opinion and that of the A strategy in general. On the following page, Flood inverted and reflected this symbol, replacing creation with a 4-letter name for God known as the Tetragrammaton. This name, along with its triangular enclosure, is a symbol of Flood's opinion of God, as he indicated in the corner of his portrait, as well as the B strategy as a whole. The entire dualistic symbol is therefore a Western equivalent to the Taijitu, a synthetic union of opposites. However, unlike the perfect balance between yin and yang, Flood's symbol contains an unmistakable bias. The higher triangle, which represents the B strategy, is the most divine and beautiful object, of which the lower is the incomprehensible shadow. Of course, the B strategy, which values symbols, will depict its truth as superior to its antithesis. Although the quaternarian and trinitarian forms are present on both sides of the symbol, they are not given equal rank, because each strategy believes that its God is the true God. The conflict between these two opinions of God was explored by Carl Jung in his essay, A Psychological Approach to the Dogma of the Trinity. The main goal of this essay is to uncover the origin of the religious belief in the A strategy, which Jung describes as a dogma of the Trinity. The sole reason for the dogma lies in the Christian message, which caused a psychic revolution in Western man. But the problem with this Christian message, in its Trinitarian form, is that it was missing something, namely the nocturnal side of the psyche's nature, the darkness of the spirit, and is also without sin. Thus arises the problem of the fourth. On its own, the Trinity is an incomplete totality. Its perfection is an illusion created by dismissing the source of imperfection. Jung suggested adding the devil to the Trinity, and I'm going to quote him at length on this, since he's describing the moral dilemma that is produced by the archetype of conflict. Quote, "In our diagram, Christ and the devil appear as equal and opposite, thus conforming to the idea of the adversary. This opposition means conflict to the last, and it is the task of humanity to endure this conflict until the time or turning point is reached where good and evil begin to relativize themselves, to doubt themselves, and the cry is raised for a morality beyond good and evil. In the age of Christianity, and in the domain of Trinitarian thinking, such an idea is simply out of the question, because the conflict is too violent for evil to be assigned any other logical relation to the Trinity than that of an absolute opposite. In an emotional opposition, i.e. in a conflict situation, thesis and antithesis cannot be viewed together at the same time. This only becomes possible with cooler assessment of the relative value of good and the relative non-value of evil. Then it can no longer be doubted either that a common life unites not only the Father and the light Son, but the Father and his dark emanation." In the earliest days of Christianity, the problem of the fourth was a distinctly moral problem, akin to the problem of evil. But over time, as cooler assessments have prevailed, the problem has sublimated into a logical question of how to combine a threefold opinion of God with its fourfold variant. As we saw in Part 3 in the 13th century, Raymond Lull had designed a method for resolving conflicts within a Christian framework. This might not seem remarkable until you learn that his method comprised both a Trinitarian phase and a Quaternarian phase. By the 18th century, Immanuel Kant had arranged his 12 categories of the understanding in 4 sets of 3, and in the works of his successor Hegel, there exists an intriguing diagram of 4 triangles connected with alchemical symbols. The leap from Christ and the devil to geometric categories of the understanding is a big one, but it symbolizes the progressive ambition of humanity to resolve the conflict between good and evil. If we split the difference between Kant and Lull somewhere around the rediscovery of Plato in the 15th century, we find a critical threshold in the development of the human psyche. In the wake of Renaissance Neoplatonism, the opportunity arose for these kinds of symbols to be created. Wolfgang Pauli stated that Flood's images, in particular, serve as proof of the existence of a symbol that had simultaneously a religious and a scientific function. These are more than just esoteric artworks, they are scientific diagrams, insofar as they display facts about their creator's psychology, or, if you like, facts about the memes of God, creation, and knowledge itself. What is truly fascinating is that this hybrid functionality appears in other symbols from the same period. For example, the illustrated works of Jacob Boehme symbolize the A and B strategies as 2 eyes. Perceiving only the Trinity, the eye is drooping shut and remains submerged in the darkness of the psyche. But with the superimposition of the cross, the eye becomes illuminated by a new meaning of knowledge, one that is depicted as superior to knowledge of the Trinity alone. Summarizing the difference in a single image, the enlightened eye is filled with the waters of the union between 3 and 4, while the closed eye fails to receive this insight. However, both eyes grow from the same root, as the Trinity remains a necessary but inferior ground of knowledge. Much like Flood's symbol, these authors would have us believe that they possess a form of knowledge that is superior to their opponents. But within the archetype of conflict, these symbols are polemical by design and promote the bias of the B strategy. Don't forget, A and B are competing for the truth, and by studying their interaction through symbols, we are relying on the preference of the B strategy. So naturally, these symbols will depict their antithesis as something like a mundane eye or an incomprehensible shadow. So how does the A strategy defend itself against these attacks? Well, in the course of their debate, Kepler captured this in an elegant metaphor. It started when Flood said, "Kepler has hold of the tail, I grasp the head. I perceive the first cause, he its effects." Kepler replied, "I hold the tail, but I hold it in my hand. You may grasp the head mentally, though only I fear in your dreams. I am content with the effects." This metaphor reveals that the archetype of conflict is predictably defined by an asymmetry of knowledge. What would you do if someone said that they knew something that you couldn't possibly know? Would you call them elitist, or maybe delusional? This is how the A strategy responds to the B strategy's claim of superior knowledge, by attacking its self-opinion. The outcome is anything but settled, however, because the meaning of knowledge is different on each side, and how we frame this difference can vary immensely, from a logical distinction between threeness and fourness, all the way up to the utmost religious divide between sacred enlightenment and profane ignorance. In the 5th and final part of this series, we'll examine a religious conflict from the 2nd century AD, when the B strategy was first emerging as a distinct opponent to the A strategy. As Jung stated in his essay, this opposition really does mean conflict to the last, and it is the task of humanity to endure this conflict until the time or turning point is reached where good and evil begin to relativize themselves, to doubt themselves, and the cry is raised for a morality beyond good and evil.